So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Today is for this evening session of Popping the Science Bubble. This is a monthly seminar series that aims to share new research findings from grad students and postdocs at UC Berkeley with the general public and create constructive discussion about a variety of science topics. We have two speakers at each seminar who will talk about their current research or a topic they find really interesting. The organizers are three graduate students at UC Berkeley, Jenna, Madison, and Oksana. If you're interested in checking out their past seminars, you can visit their website or check out their Twitter or Facebook. And we put previous Popping the Science Bubble videos on YouTube too, which are great for viewing. You can also sign up on their listserv to keep current and keep in the loop about the upcoming seminar topics, and check the Berkeley Public Library events calendar. Our speakers are delighted to talk today, and you can follow up at Popping the Science Bubble website to learn more. So thank you so much. Additional announcements include that the Berkeley Public Library is reopening branches. Our North Branch, West Branch, and today our Central Branch are open for visiting from 2 to 6 p.m. And we're just at the Berkeley Public Library. We are just so excited to welcome people in. So thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over the program to Madison to introduce our Science Bubble team. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Kelsey. Yeah, we're excited to bring you two fun talks tonight. A reminder that this format is hopefully very conversational, so feel free to put questions either in the chat or the Q&A or the Facebook comment section, and we'll be monitoring to hopefully ask our speakers during the talk. But we're here the third Tuesday of every month, bringing you two talks from researchers at UC Berkeley, and kind of just hoping to share our day-to-day interest in science and its process with you guys. So I think we're excited for the two talks today, and Jenna will introduce our first speaker.
So our first speaker today is Teena Bajaj, who was born in New Delhi, India. She did her undergraduate degree in biochemistry at the University of Delhi. After that, she did a master's program in biophysics. Now she is a graduate student in the Comparative Biochemistry program and works on different translational sciences projects. Outside of lab, she is passionate about health and likes to walk in the sun and play sports such as badminton. We are very excited for your talk. Take it away, Teena.
Thank you, Oksana, for kind introduction. I'm sharing my screen. I hope everybody can see this, right? So hi everyone, my name is Teena Bajaj, and the title of my talk today is Building a Stronger Postman, that is improving messenger RNAs. So let's start. So I would like to ask a question to everybody. Who is the king of a cell? Can anybody answer? Are we getting answers?
Yeah, you guys are free to answer in the chat.
Oh, maybe this is the right way. So the answer is DNA. DNA stands for Deoxyribonucleic Acid, right? So DNA has all the information which requires for the cell. It's kind of a recipe book. When you go for the kitchen and you have recipe book which contains all the information, what kind of recipe has to be made and how. So DNA has all the information stored in it for all the cells and all the body function. So he's the king. Next, who is the brother of the DNA in the cell? Looking for the answer. Anybody?
Jenna says RNA.
Yes. RNA, ribonucleic acid. Why I asked about who is the brother? Why I use brother? Because if you think about your brother or any sibling, you see that you have some common traits with him or her, right? So similarly, DNA and RNA has some similar common features, like they share nucleotides. They share the phosphodiester bond, sugar phosphate backbone through which they are made up of. That's why we say like they are kind of siblings. So DNA and RNA both are made up of sugar phosphate backbone, that is ribose, sugar, but there's a difference that DNA consists of 2-oxyribose, that it is at the 2' of carbon of the ribose, it is missing hydroxyl group, whereas RNA has hydroxyl group. And out of 4 nucleotides, triphosphates, DNA consists of thymine, whereas RNA consists of uracil. This is one of the great difference we see in the structural differences of RNA and DNA. So my question is, what does mRNA do? mRNA actually act as a postman. Since DNA consists of all the information, now it needs to do something, right? But it has a limitation that DNA cannot go out of its kingdom, that is nucleus. So there should be something transporting that information from DNA to outside of the cell who could do, outside of a nucleus inside the cell who could do who take all this information and pass to the workforce of the cell, which is protein. Now, this mRNA actually takes all the information from DNA and passes to the protein and makes the workforce to do its work. So in short, I would say mRNA is a postman, which takes all the information from DNA, converts it into its language, and gives to the protein so that a cell could be a functional. Now let's think, if anybody has any wrong information in DNA, what would happen? Genetic diseases, right? It is very difficult to change your mutant gene, a defective gene. And ultimately, when you have a mutant gene or defective gene, you have a protein of non-functional or inactive protein, which leads to a disease. So how about if we correct the protein at the mRNA level, which does not have to go into the nucleus? You directly inject that in the cell, and that would be converting into the protein and removing the disease. So there is an idea came that mRNA could be acting as a drug. If you inject mRNA into the cell mRNA would be converting into protein, and patient's life could be saved. And it's not that it is only for only one kind of disease. 99% of diseases could be just because of defective DNA. So we can save lot of patients by this. But the problem is mRNA are a very unstable molecule. Due to the hydroxyl group on the 2' end of this ribose, which is a main culprit in disrupting this bond of the RNA actually gets self-degrade by itself into 2 molecules, in small molecules. So they are very unstable by its own. Their nature is very labile. So that's why we thought, how about if we try to improve the stability of mRNA? And in addition to that, there are so many enzymes present in the cell which actually cuts the RNA inside the cell, and they just chew up all the RNA and just degrade them. So if you add, even if you add the mRNA in the cell directly to the cytoplasm, they can be chewed by ribonuclease and they won't ever express as a protein. So therefore, we want to make a mRNA which is very stable, not chewed by ribonucleases, and it could express into the protein.
Hey, Teena, I have a very general question. I guess if that hydroxyl group is so unstable, like why, I guess, has it persisted, you know, like throughout the years of evolution and stuff? Like, is there any benefit to having an unstable, like, hydroxyl group in that position?
It's a very great question, I would say. Maybe the nature of mRNA is to degrade. It could be. I'm not sure that what could be the answer why it is very unstable. Means why its nature is very unstable, right? We understand why RNA is unstable, but we don't understand why the nature of the mRNA is very labile, why it tends to degrade by itself even if you keep it on the bench. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Just wanted to know if there were any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So since we want to, stabilize the mRNA, so there are two components which I feel that could be replaced. So if you look over 2' OH, which I told about, like main culprit, and this phosphodiester bond, which is mainly affected by this 2' OH. So if we change this hydroxyl with 2' F or 2' OCH3, which are very inert molecule and cannot be not very nucleophilic as hydroxyl, we can save the attack of hydroxyl to this phosphodiester bond. Or next, or we could change this phosphodiester bond with phosphorothioate bond, in which this OH group, hydroxyl group, won't be able to attack over phosphate backbone chain, and your mRNA would be stabilized. So in order to do that, we did some experiment, and I won't be able to reveal the specific modification, but we got some modification which was stabilizing the mRNA and giving high protein expression. So in this way, we can figure out that which chemical modification is being tolerated by cells and expressing high amounts of protein. And then we can add that specific mRNA of specific protein and have we can inject for a patient body and cure the disease. So there is a summary that mRNA is a very important genetic molecule which delivers all the messages from DNA to protein. That is the workforce of the cell. mRNA is a very unstable molecule, and modification in the mRNA at 2' OH and phosphodiester bond could stabilize the mRNA, which could further help us in treating genetic diseases. And with that, I say thank you to everybody for attention, and I welcome any questions you have.
Guess while we're waiting for people who have questions, just type it in the chat box. I have a very general one again. So are there any genetic diseases that have been treated by the modification of mRNA that's like widely available now as treatment?
So people are close to that. Yes, there are people have done it's it has been it's close. So there's a disease called diabetes, and people have introducing kind of pseudouridine in mRNA to stabilize the mRNA, and they injected that, and it's happening. And people have done experiments in mice so that they could treat cardiomyopathy and dilated cardiomyopathy and cardiac hypertrophy as well, myocardial infarction as well. So yeah, people are doing experiments in mice. So they have crossed that bar as well. I'm pretty sure we are looking forward to humans as well.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool.
I have a slightly different question, just related to kind of what makes diseases. So you said like 99% of them come from DNA instability. But is there ever, like, are there known diseases where the DNA is fine, but the RNA is like mutated consistently? Like the postman's just not doing his job even though he has the right message? Or in general, is it always thought that the mutations come from the DNA side?
Great question. I think it could happen that, means it could happen that somehow polymerase did not perform its function very well. So it's a problem that polymerase is not functioning well, and that is coming from DNA, right? It is leading to, but I really think that if a person has some diseases, it must be coming from its DNA. And I agree that environment also makes some effect, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, it's the, I would say like 90% of diseases coming from defect in DNA, but of course environment also has some effect. I totally agree.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question for me, I guess more about like working in the lab. So how do you actually work with extract the mRNA? Like a cell is really small, and then to be able to just isolate the mRNA, how does that happen? Is it really hard?
So I don't work with cells for this experiment. When I say I make the mRNA, I actually make in tubes in vitro transcription. We take I take plasmid of specific gene, reporter gene, and then make it linearize, and then using T7 polymerase I make mRNA. If I'm making normal mRNA, I will be using AUGC triphosphates, and if I'm making modified, then I would replace one of the nucleotides with its modified version.
Okay. I guess that's more straightforward than like trying to take apart a cell and then taking out the.
I think then I won't be able to, because you don't know what is happening, right?
That's true. That's true. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. If we don't have any more questions, at least for now, maybe we'll move on to the second talk. And if you do have a question that comes up later, feel free to just pop it into the chat box, and Teena will be able to answer it in the chat. Okay, and so for our next speaker, Daniel. So Daniel grew up in southeastern Australia, a few hours out of Melbourne, Victoria. He completed his undergraduate and PhD in Adelaide, South Australia, where he also put on comedy shows with a music group there. And he's toured those shows around Australia and the UK. Daniel still enjoys writing and playing since moving to Berkeley in 2019. He's currently working with AI for particle physics and other fun areas as a postdoctoral research at Berkeley Lab. That research involves some fascinating machine learning technologies, which he loves to play around with in other projects, for example, facial recognition, robotic interactions, news bias checking, and others. And since COVID, Daniel's tried to learn skateboarding, but that failed. But on another note, we'll welcome Daniel and learn about his research. Take it away, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Let me share this. Got it. Okay, nice. Thanks so much for letting me show some of the couple of the fun ideas that we're playing around with to try and solve what is a little bit of a crisis in particle physics that's going to be coming up in the next few years. And I'm going to try and present it in a way that will maybe bring to mind some of the ideas that you might be familiar with when people talk about machine learning and AI. So I want to start with just laying down some kind of basic concepts that I'll refer back to. So the first thing I want to ask is, I'm going to show some of President Biden's favorite particles, and you'll probably recognize them. So here are some of them. I'm sure I don't even need to ask you. We can all recognize these beautiful particles. Unfortunately not. In reality, I don't think I recognize any of them. In fact, this is actually Biden's family. So if you look closely, you might notice, and you might recognize some of Joe and Jill in there. Maybe their kids are in there, grandkids. If you were able to zoom in and get high resolution, then I'm sure you all could. Because for some reason, the human brain is much better at recognizing people, right? It's really good at recognizing photographs of family and friends and celebrities and animals. And for some reason, it's really bad at recognizing complicated physics. And the question is this to do with the human brain, or is there something particularly difficult about physics that you don't find in a face? So it would be nice to answer this. So let's have a look at some basic machine learning to see if we can answer it. So it's going to get a little bit technical here, but let's say we want to train a machine learning model to recognize a cat and a dog. So what normally you have to do is define something called a vector. It's got two numbers, and let's say if a picture is of a cat, then we say it has a 1 in the first position. If the picture is of a dog, then we say it has a 1 in the second position. This is just a simple way of defining a cat and a dog. We can do this with celebrities as well, but it's much harder, right? Because we don't just have 2 celebrities, we have thousands of celebrities. So already this normal concept of machine learning that we're used to thinking about as classification, it's not really classification. We can't really feed into a model, thousands of zeros and 1 that represents Brad Pitt. It doesn't work very well. And moreover, that's not really what the human brain is doing, right? We don't have in our brain some special place in our brain for Brad Pitt. What really we're doing is we're searching through our memories when we see Brad Pitt, and we're placing him in some space that's close to other Brad Pitts from our memory. So in reality, there's a much simpler way of representing Brad Pitt than a huge list of zeros and ones. You can embed Brad Pitt into a space. It's called an embedded space. And you can say that if the next picture of Brad Pitt that we see gets sent into a part of the space that lines up with your other memories of Brad Pitt, then it's probably Brad Pitt. If it was a picture of Angelina Jolie, then hopefully your brain would work and it would arrive in the space of Angelina Jolie, and you'd match it up. You'd search for similar examples. And it turns out that's a much more flexible way of teaching a model how to recognize people. But let's go back to cats, dogs for a second and just see how this actually works in a machine learning model. I've just put the actual, what's called the loss function, which is the way of punishing and rewarding the model up there if you're interested, but it's not really important. So what happens is we send our cat and a dog through some black box. It's really not important how it works, but the point is it can learn something. You can teach it. We send it into a space randomly. And if the cat and the dog are close in that space, then we've done something wrong, right? We want to separate cats and dogs, just like we separated Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie in our model, not in real life. Hopefully they stay together forever. So if they are together in this embedded space, then we want to punish our model and we want to push the dog away from the cat. And we call this repulsive training. We want to punish it. If, however, we had two cats, then we would want to embed them close together. So we put them through the model randomly, and oh no, they were embedded far apart. So we need to actually attract them together. We need to tell the model that it's done something wrong, and we should pull the cats closer together. That's the basic style of machine learning that we're using. And eventually we do that with a whole bunch of examples of cats, a whole bunch of examples of dogs, and we create some embedded space of cats and dogs.
Daniel?
Sure.
Sorry, I can ask a question?
Yeah.
So if, like, you're telling the model, if it thinks a cat and a dog are very similar, no, they're not supposed to be very similar, so don't take them as similar. How does that model then also know how to, in the future, tell them apart? Is it just once they've done enough and enough and enough that you've told them they're not similar anymore, they can categorize them? Or are they saying, oh, these things are different, these things are the same, so we'll expect one of these different categories to always be different between cats and dogs?
No, it's a really good question. And at the start, as I said, it embeds it randomly, right? So they go into some space and they have to be close. And we tell it, no, that was wrong. They should be far apart. It turns out that, okay, for the first few examples you give it, it's kind of embedding randomly. But this model is getting smarter each time you send them through, and you punish it and reward it, punish it, reward it. And what they call the weights in this model are updating for every single example. And the fact is, it's not obvious how it learns, because there's nothing about these pictures of dogs that, you know, superficially differentiate them from these pictures of cats, right? You can't look and say, well, the color scheme is clearly dogs and the color scheme here is clearly cats. I mean, okay, there are some differences, but the fact is that the model, just like any computer vision machine learning, is actually learning something quite subtle about the shapes. You know, for example, it would be learning that typically cats' ears point upwards and dogs' ears point downwards on average. So there would be some dimension of this space that would actually have to do with ears pointing up and down. And the fact is, although I put it as like a three-dimensional space here, normally these spaces are 10, 20, 30 dimensions. And so the model is actually learning a dimension for ears, and it's learning a dimension for eyes and whiskers and so on. So yeah, it's true. As it goes through, it gets more and more examples. Then if you went back and fed that original pair back through, it would have learned to differentiate them much better. So that's the idea.
Cool, thank you.
No worries. And so maybe that's all there is to it. Maybe like Biden's favorite particles, we just put them all through this model and it's able to separate them into, just like Brad Pitt's and Angelina Jolie's, it's able to put them into some space of, you know, Higgs bosons and quarks and gluons and whatever the hell we want. But it's not quite that easy, because there's something that photos have, pictures have, that particle events don't have, which is that a photo is dense. So a way of seeing this is that, okay, this is obviously George Clooney, but it's still George Clooney, and it's still pretty clearly George Clooney, even if you mess around with the picture. If you make it noisy, if you make it blurry, and you can go ahead and try and cover the clear George Clooney, and make sure you still can recognize it's George Clooney. It's pretty obvious that it is. But if you did this with particle data, it really destroys the basic underlying information. And this has something to do with the representation of the data. So this is an actual particle event. This is a collision. I'll get into what collisions and all the physics in a second. I just want to like lay down why we want to care about photographs and so on. These are all the pieces of the particles. They split apart into all these little jigsaw pieces. But most of this picture is actually empty space, right? Even when a particle explodes, just like real matter is mostly empty space. And so when you blur each of these little hits into the picture on the right-hand side, you're losing a lot of information in the way that you're not really losing information here. The human brain is still able to grab Clooney's eye, Clooney's mouth, even if you can't see each of Clooney's hairs and eyebrows and beard, whiskers. You're losing something with this particle collision. You're losing the whiskers and the hair and the eyebrows of this particle, and that's actually super useful. So we need to represent this photo, this particle event, as something else, something that isn't a photo. And it turns out that a really nice way to represent these particle collisions and events are as graphs. And when I say graph here, I mean there's a little bit ambiguous. A lot of people think of a graph as like a plot. But here we're just thinking of a graph as a set of points that's connected with lines. And it turns out that's a really nice way to represent these kind of particle events. So this is an actual event. It's super simple mini event where we have a bunch of particles that are flying out from the center of this collision. And you can see pretty clearly by eye that the particles are labeled with their different colors, and we'd like to be able to connect them up in some way. And when we connect them all up, that forms a graph. And actually, that's a much more efficient way of representing one of these collisions. And it turns out that within the last couple of years, there's been a new AI technique that works really, really well on graphs, and it's called graph neural networks. And it's kind of the graph equivalent of these AI techniques that work on photographs. And so computer vision has come a long way in the last 10 years to the point where you should be able to train machine learning model to recognize cats, dogs, George Clooney easily. That's kind of considered the first task of someone learning machine learning models. But nowadays, graph neural networks are kind of coming into that same journey. Okay, so that's sort of the language that I just wanted to set up. So let's go and look a little bit at the history of the physics itself. So here's a physics event, a particle event. This is back from the 1920s, so you can actually see the particles themselves. It's a little bit, it looks kind of messy, but in terms of today's physics, it's actually quite simple. You can actually see the tracks that the particles are making in this cloud chamber. So this is just particles traveling through some vapor and leaving a trail. You can see these nice curls that come from the magnetic field. And back in the day, in the 20s and the 30s, people would actually sit down and trace out these particles. And actually, a lot of work was done, most of the time by women that were extremely undervalued at the time. I think they produced a lot of amazing results back in the 20s and 30s that then basically male physicists came along and won prizes for, which was kind of a shame. But at the end of the day, they all worked together in their own way and made some amazing discoveries with these kind of particle event pictures. And so this was back in the 20s. So even in the 70s, we started actually colliding particles together. So this is just some experiments from the last 50 years. In the 70s, we had an experiment at CERN, so CERN in Switzerland. We discovered various particles throughout the last 40 and 50 years. And finally, we discovered the Higgs boson in 2010, or 2012, actually, but the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, was built in 2010. And the goal is that in about 2027, we're going to open the next phase of the Large Hadron Collider, which is basically called a Higgs factory. It's going to produce around 15 million Higgs bosons every year, which has come a long way considering we were super excited to discover even one in 2012. Now we're producing a heck of a lot of Higgs bosons. That's the plan. I'll skim over some of the details here, but the point is that our dream is we want to produce a bunch of Higgs bosons. As to why, who knows? It's nice to have Higgs bosons. It's nice to discover the fundamental rules of the universe, and it turns out that the Higgs boson is sort of the final piece of our fundamental theory of particle physics called the Standard Model. So we want to be able to produce some interesting particles that will help us understand this fundamental theory. So for example, the Higgs boson. But the Higgs is super heavy, so we need to actually smash things together at high speeds to produce them. We can't just use one particle to produce the Higgs, because by itself it doesn't know its own energy, and that's kind of counterintuitive, but that comes from Einstein's relativity. You actually have to have two particles so that they're able to see each other and understand what energy they have. So if you want a high energy, you need at least two particles, and therefore you need to smash them into each other. So that's kind of the heart of collider physics. It's just colliding particles so that we can get high energies. And it turns out that colliding things together brings a lot of awesome results. You can discover the Higgs boson. Quarks is another fundamental particle. Neutrino is another fundamental particle that we discovered actually has a mass. That's quite exciting, and that breaks our understanding of the normal rules. There's a bunch of other stuff that we could discover that we haven't yet discovered, but hopefully, if we do discover it, it will be because of colliding particles together. And the basic problem of colliding particles together is called track reconstruction. So you can think of it kind of like, I don't know if you ever saw these crime scene investigator shows where people do a drive-by shooting, they shoot into walls, and then along comes, you know, someone in sunglasses who's really smart, and they need to figure out how the bullets traveled through the walls. And so they use lasers, or they use straws or pieces of string, and they try and recreate how the bullets were firing through all these walls by lining up all the string and all the lasers and doing some forensics. And it's the exact same process that we have for track reconstruction. So track reconstruction is where you have each of these bullets firing through the layers of a detector, kind of like an onion, leaving all these little hits behind. The difference between the case of CSI Miami and LHC is that we have trillions of bullets every second, and the bullets can curve because there's a magnetic field. So it becomes a tricky problem. And the problem is that the current solutions don't work very well when you have that many bullets. The way the current solutions work is kind of like if you think back to the human brain trying to figure out whether it's George Clooney or not. The current solutions will look at a picture and think, okay, does this person's eye look like Angelina Jolie's eye? No. Does this person's eye look like Brad Pitt's eye? No. And it will work through this huge list of possibilities. And then eventually we'll find out, okay, it's George Clooney's eye. Great. Does this person's mouth look like Angelina Jolie's mouth? No. Does it look like Brad Pitt's mouth? No. It's a very, it scales poorly, which is to say that if the more George Clooney pictures you have, it becomes harder and harder to get all these George Clooney pictures right, because you have to scroll through your entire list of celebrities. And it's working in a similar way. It's basically solving some big problem to do with all of these hits. But of course, that's not how the human brain works, right? You just look at George Clooney, you know it's George Clooney. You don't need to filter through all the parts of his face and all the other celebrities you know. So already that's kind of a hint that the current techniques, which get really, really expensive really quickly, are probably not the smartest way to do it. And the fact is that going back from the 1920s, where we had about 10 of these particles per second, nowadays we have around 30 trillion particles every second. So we can't do it by hand and eye anymore, unfortunately. So I'm part of a project called the Exotrex project at Berkeley Lab. And we are trying to combine these ideas of graphs and recognizing George Clooney and so on with recognizing particles. And it's combining a few of the ideas that I mentioned already. So for example, we want to take our list of hits, like the bullet hitting through the wall, and we want to build a graph out of that. Like I said, a graph is a nice, simple way to join up these hits. Then we want to apply this cool new technique that I mentioned, graph neural networks, to figure out which of these edges, which of the lines connecting the hits, are true and which ones are fake. And then we want to basically separate out all of these tracks to figure out which, like the bullets in the crime scene, which came from which bullet. So the first step is kind of like the cats and dogs going into a space, but obviously it's much more complicated because there's thousands of these hits. We want to take all of these hits. I've just picked a few of them randomly and colored them. And we want to place them through this learning model, just like the cats and dogs, into some embedded space. And hopefully in this embedded space, hits that are from the same particle will be close together, just like how cats were close together and dogs were close together, and they were far apart from each other. The exact same rule hopefully works in this space. But the problem is that by itself, just like how if you squint when you looked at the blurry particles, this embedded space is not the whole story. In fact, it's just the first step. We want to connect all the hits together that are close into a graph. So this is the graph that we start with. And maybe I'm biting off more than I can chew here, but the idea would be to teach a machine learning model how to understand a graph. And this is the exciting new technique that's come out in the last couple of years, which is called a graph neural network. So to understand it in basic terms, a graph neural network takes each of the hits in a graph, it creates some black box, and it's not important what this is. The point is this black box is a learnable thing. The model can actually learn what is in this box. It's a way of representing each of the hits, each of the nodes. And it joins up each of these black boxes with all of its neighbors and creates a score for each of the edges. It does this for all of the edges, and then each node absorbs all of the information from its neighbors. And this is called message passing. It's a way that the model is able to pass information around the graph in kind of the same way that a computer vision model looks at Clooney's eyes, Clooney's mouth, Clooney's nose, and tries to understand in broad strokes what a human looks like. This is the graph equivalent of that kind of AI technique. And it does this again and again and again. It passes the information around the node, around the graph, until eventually it comes to understand what is the hits coming from the same particle. And in that way, it's actually able to learn what the event looks like. So for example, each of these steps is the message passing. This is the information spreading around the graph. The model is learning what the graph looks like. The plot here is true edges that actually connect hits from the same particle, and fake edges that don't connect hits from the same particle. And as the model learns and passes messages around the graph, it gets better and better, just like the cats and dogs. It gets better and better at splitting true and fake edges. In this way, it's kind of taking this big graph, and through each step of its message passing, it's learning what are the properties of each part of the graph, until it's able to figure out, is it a Higgs boson? Is it a quark? Is it some new physics that we haven't discovered yet? So the point is that it actually works. It works really, really well. Combining this kind of embedding space, just like the cats and dogs into a space, plus the graph machine learning works really well. And so while in the past, we basically took some data, we did some maths, we got some high order physics understanding of what that data actually meant. And then some theorists looked at that physics, did some more maths, and then won a Nobel Prize. That's what has happened basically up until the last 2 or 3 years. As of very recently, we're able to skip that math and just plug in the pure data. And we're almost at the point within the last year, and maybe including the next year, where we're able to produce directly interesting physical quantities from this raw data. Now, at the moment, a theorist, theoretical physicist, still needs to stare at that data for a long time before they win their Nobel Prize and do some math. But the hope is that using the exact same techniques, you know, separating the cats and dogs and learning the photographs, but with some graph techniques, we're able to skip even that step, because that step's not really that important. I mean, due respect to the tens of thousands of phenomenological physicists out there. The problem is, really, we want to just go straight from raw data to a Nobel Prize winning theory. And there's nothing really stopping a model from learning that. And my hope is that within the next 5 or 10 years, we might be able to figure out those techniques. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that nice talk, Daniel. So yeah, if people have questions in the chat, feel free to put them in the chat.
If I could maybe start off before everyone gets into the chat, and I apologize, Daniel, if you did say this and I missed it. What's the big deal about finding out the energy of a Higgs boson particle? Why is learning what its energy is super important?
That's a very good question, because we've clearly spent billions of dollars trying to do it, right? So it must be important. Yeah, that's my answer. We've spent so much money. No. A lot of money and a lot of careers have been spent trying to figure out the exact mass of the Higgs boson down to, you know, the nearest percent. And the reason is that the better we can understand the mass of the Higgs and the mass of all the other particles in the center bubble, the better we know exactly how wrong it's going to be when we come along with the next theory, because we know that this theory is not the final answer. I don't think there's any particle physicist that thinks the standard model is the final theory of particle physics. And if we only have a kind of hand-wavy knowledge about the mass of the Higgs and all these other numbers that live in the standard model, then we won't be able to say exactly when new physics comes along, because we, at this point, need to be super precisely measured to find new physics hidden in the cracks of our current model. And so the closer we can sort of squeeze the Higgs exactly down, then we'll know exactly when something disagrees with the current model. And at the moment, everything unfortunately agrees perfectly. I think everyone is super depressed that the standard model works perfectly well. And it probably will for at least another decade, until, you know, China builds a big enough detector to prove it wrong.
So if I can restate in the way that I understood that, we know that our model doesn't explain everything, but what we can observe it explains. So we want to find something that we can observe that it can't explain to figure out what we need to fix?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right, and then we do have a question from Michael Chang in the chat asking, what about gathering data? How do we determine what data to collect? Collect all of it?
Like
Collect
Pokemon?
some?
Maybe. Yeah, I think collecting as much as possible is a good start. There are smarter data points together than others, for sure. For example, the Higgs mass is a good example of a smart piece of data together. Because the fact is there are lots of other pieces of data in the standard model that we're not really looking at too closely because it's probably not going to be affected by new physics. And I know that's probably a really unsatisfying answer, but long story short, any new physics is going to probably affect the heavier particles more than the light ones. This has to do with a bunch of theories that people have about what the new physics is probably going to look like. So the heavy particles, things like Higgs boson, the top quark, the W and Z bosons, these are really heavy particles. And if we can understand their masses really precisely and how they interact with each other, those are really important pieces of data to spend time and money on, because if we got them wrong, if our predictions for those masses are wrong, that's a really good indication that there's new physics waiting around the corner. But at this point, and part of the answer is the light particles we've known about for 100 years, right? We've known about the electron forever. Not really forever, but 100 years. So we know it really well. We know its mass really well. We don't have to spend billions of dollars studying the electron anymore. Yeah.
And then a follow-up to that is, who will decide smart data, people or AI?
Yeah, that's the big question for sure. Up until recently, it's been people. Up until recently, the sort of chain of command goes, theoretical physicists will say, we think dark matter is interesting. And so they'll give that problem to phenomenological physicists. And those phenomenological physicists will say, okay, dark matter is probably something to do with gravity. Maybe it's something to do with heavy particles. Let's try and study those two things. And then they take that and give it to experimental physicists. And they say, okay, heavy particles, we should probably build a collider that can study heavy particles like the LHC. So this chain of command is very people, dependent, and that's good. Like, it's nice that we as scientists understand what drives research, right? And what forces us to spend billions of dollars. But it's getting to the point maybe where a model, for example, one of these metric learning models or a graph neural network, might come along and look at a piece of data and say, actually, there's more to this than you think there is. You should spend more time, more money running these kind of experiments and getting this kind of data, because there's something interesting happening. And maybe the model won't be able to tell us what is interesting. It will only be able to say, look closely, look more closely. But that's a little bit scary, because it might be that in the next decade, we have these kind of machine learning models telling us where to spend money. And it's already hard enough convincing the EU to spend another $2 billion on a collider, and that's when people are defending it. Yeah, I hate to think what happens when it's all they can say is, well, the algorithm told us to do it. That's going to be a tough sell, but it's kind of the right sell, I think.
And then maybe more of just a general question. I'm always curious, like with theoreticians, basically, what is your research day to day like? Have you worked actually with these data sets from CERN and stuff, or are you able to like get other types of data in order to like optimize the machine learning?
Nowadays, I do use simulated data sets from the LHC, which is kind of the closest that you can get when you want to do machine learning, because of course, when you want to train these models, you actually have to know the truth. So you can teach them when they're wrong and when they're right. But of course, if you use the raw data from the LHC, we don't know the truth. So it's not actually so useful to train these models. Yeah, so day to day, we use these simulations of particle events, and honestly, most of my day, 99% of my day, is fixing bugs in my code that I wrote when I was too tired, and every mistake takes hours to fix. Every minute that I save takes hours to fix. And then the other 1% is kind of staring at a whiteboard, trying to think, okay, how could you change this machine learning architecture so that it's that better represents the problem we're trying to solve? That's kind of the split.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. That was a really cool talk. Much more physicsy than I feel like I've gotten in a while, which I really enjoyed. If you guys enjoyed Daniel's talks, he's given us a few resources if you are interested in machine learning or particle physics that we will share on our website as well as our Twitter that you can check up to follow up on this topic if you're interested. And then I think Kelsey will close us out.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Teena, for just giving such fantastic presentations tonight. As always, thank you, Popping the Science Bubble team, for bringing such great speakers. As mentioned earlier, the Science Bubble, this session was recorded, and the Science Bubble team has a YouTube channel that has videos for previous sessions that are great to watch. This is a monthly presentation series that happens on the third Tuesday of every month at 5:30 p.m. So please tune in next month. Thank you so much.